Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webinar, Teaching Sex Ed, Understanding Sexualized Violence. For your information, all participants' microphones are muted today. If you have any questions that you would like to be addressed after the presentation, please use the Q&A box that's located in the bottom center of your screen. The chat box is also available if you have any comments or technical questions. My name is Savannah Holt. I'm the Sexual and Reproductive Health Program Coordinator with the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute. The Prevention Institute is a provincial nonprofit organization that's located in Saskatoon on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Our organizational focus is to reduce disabling conditions in children using primary prevention methods. We raise awareness by providing training, information, and resources based on current best evidence. We believe that all children, regardless of ability, have the right to the best physical, social, and emotional health possible. We work in a variety of areas, including sexual and reproductive health, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder prevention, maternal and infant health, early childhood mental health, child injury prevention, child traffic safety, and parenting. One focus of the Sexual and Reproductive Health Program is to provide evidence-based information on sexual and reproductive health that is accessible to health educators and to the youth that they work with. Saskatchewan has high rates of sexually transmitted infections, unintended teen pregnancy, and sexualized violence. Research shows that age-appropriate comprehensive sexual health education can reduce risky sexual behavior and can increase responsible sexual decision-making, and providing education on healthy relationships, consent, and other violence prevention measures is imperative in our work to end interpersonal violence and abuse. It is now my sincere pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Morgan Price is a registered social worker that has been working at the Saskatoon Sexual Assault Information Center since January 2018. She first started as a practicum student and evolved into a counselor, coordinator of SAKE's Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Program, I'm the Boss of Me, and she's now the Education and Outreach Coordinator. Morgan believes in bringing people together through compassion and humility and is honored to be a voice for sexualized violence survivors in her community. Welcome, Morgan.
Thanks, Savannah. Good morning, everybody. That was a beautiful introduction. I appreciate it. To get us started off on this beautiful Tuesday morning. Hello, educators. Hello, everyone joining us today. Thank you for taking time out of your day to spend time learning with us. Of course, we believe, Savannah and I, that sexualized violence education is so important, not only for our students, but also for our educators as well. So without further ado, I will jump right into our presentation today. Here we go. So Savannah did a little bit of a land acknowledgement, but I just want to acknowledge the spaces that we're all gathering from as well, and the original peoples that originated on the lands here. I am presenting from my home here in Saskatoon, just on Treaty 6 territory, homeland of the Métis Nation. So I just want to move through this presentation in the spirit of reconciliation and challenge you all to move through your lives with the spirit of reconciliation and keeping the needs of the original peoples of this land at the forefront of your hearts and minds. In regards to questions, sorry, I just see things blinking. I'm actually going to hide this because I get distracted easily. I am going to answer all questions at the end, just so we stay on track for time here. Before all my presentations, I always just want to throw out a self-care and trigger warning. I don't plan on talking about any explicit details of sexualized violence today, but from my role as a counselor, I know that anything can be a trigger potentially for anyone, and that there are likely survivors watching this video with us today. So I see you, I acknowledge you, and I just want to say that whatever comes up for you throughout this presentation is normal, and to please take care of yourself today. Even if you're watching this video at a later date, it's okay to pause, it's okay to mute me, it's okay to take a little break, get some water. The beauty of this webinar style is no one else needs to know what you need to do. So please take care of yourself in whatever way feels best for you. On that note also, we do have our counseling staff in our office today. And our crisis line is always available if you are wanting to talk to a counselor. Our number is 306-244-2224. So if you do need to give us a call, please do. I also am excited to say that this presentation is going to involve some interactive activities, which is so exciting. I know we all miss that so much from our in-person presentations. So this will be the URL that you'll need to participate today. It will all be anonymous and it will all be through typing, not through turning on your mic or camera. So if I just scared you, I'm sorry. You don't have to do that. But if you just want to type that URL into another web page browser, just so you're ready to go, and I'll let you know when I'm ready for you, when we need some of your feedback. Okay, presentation outline for today. I'm going to start by just going over some terms so we are all on the same page and know what we're talking about in regards to sexualized violence and the things that I'm going to cover today. We're going to go briefly over consent. And then I'm going to kind of double back and say why education about these things and the rest of the presentation that I'm going to talk about is so critical for our students and our young ones in our province. Then I'm going to move into what the impacts of sexualized violence may look like, could look like, what reporting kind of encompasses, a little bit on rape culture, and then we'll wrap it all up with how you as an educator can make a difference. So start off with some terminology. We've entitled this presentation, Understanding Sexualized Violence. Why have we done that? Sexualized violence is an umbrella term that we use that encompasses the other three terms that you've likely heard of before: sexual abuse, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. All three of these terms are slightly nuanced and a bit different, but sexualized violence encompasses all three. So when we're talking about the impacts of, a sexual assault or harassment, this way we can just encompass all of the impacts that one might experience from any sort of sexualized violence, because all three of these examples are violent in nature. And be sure that our language is inclusive of everyone's experience. So let's break down these three just a little further. Sexual abuse can be defined as ongoing or patterned sexualized behavior. So those two things are kind of the key to abusive behavior: ongoing and patterned, against anyone, but usually in relation to children or vulnerable adults, against anyone by someone in a position of power or authority, even if that power or authority isn't, it is perceived, So for example, a position of power or authority might be employee-employer. It might be babysitter-child. It might be coach-athlete, okay? Abuse can be physical in nature, or it can be emotionally or mentally manipulative, like coercion or threats. It can also involve like lewd comments, inappropriate comments towards someone in a vulnerable state, or grooming, which I will get into in a moment. Sexual assault, conversely, is any unwanted sexual act or behavior, so an isolated one-time incident, which is threatening, violent, forced, or coerced, and to which a person has not given, revoked, or was unable to give consent. So here the keys are that it was unwanted and that consent at some point was invalid. Sexual assaults generally are physical in nature, but can also include things like the sharing of nude photos without someone's consent. That would also count as a sexual assault, according to our Canadian law. And finally, sexual harassment, similar but slightly nuanced and different. Here we see unwelcome and inappropriate sexual remarks or physical advances. So it can be both that emotional, mental, or physical, made by someone who has power over another. So we're seeing another theme here throughout the three terms of power and control. Sometimes sexual harassment is coupled with threats or promises or rewards, in exchange for sexual favors. So we most often see sexual harassment in one of two places, in the workplace, so between peer adults that are sharing a workplace together, whether it's a restaurant or a big bank corporation. Unfortunately, sexual harassment does happen in all workplaces everywhere, especially in Saskatchewan. And also on the street would be our other most common place that we would see sexual harassment. So this would include things like catcalling, sexual jokes, staring, sexual gestures, or all the way up to, physically moving one's body toward another person in a threatening way. And the line between sexual harassment and sexual assault is a bit of a gray line, but something can move from harassment to assault pretty quickly. Just looking at our Canadian definition of what a sexual assault is. So grooming. Grooming is the process of manipulation and trust building that perpetrators use to create opportunities to abuse children or vulnerable adults. Grooming is bigger than just the sexual abuse itself. It's the whole process that occurs before the sexual abuse actually happens. And the really, really challenging part about preventing grooming or stopping grooming is that it's very difficult to detect by other adults because they are often groomed by the perpetrator as well, just in a bit of a different way. They're also involved in this process of manipulation and trust building. So all this to say that grooming is not, an accidental thing that people engage in. It's a very intentional process and very planned out and strategic, and often follows a similar pattern each time. So stage one, perpetrators look for someone that they see as vulnerable. And I should also say vulnerabilities in themselves, for example, children by default are more vulnerable than adults are. Children for maybe a single parent household might be more vulnerable simply by having one busy parent. Children with neurodivergent functioning might be more vulnerable. And vulnerabilities in themselves are not bad things. However, they are exploited by perpetrators that look for those vulnerabilities. So in stage one, the perpetrator is looking for someone who's vulnerable. In stage two, they would go through steps to gain that child's trust or that adult's trust in whatever way might make sense for that specific scenario. And just for saving of going into details, I'm not going to describe these scenarios a ton, but I'm sure you can imagine, or you've already had experience with other youth or in your personal experience with situations like this. Stage three involves filling a need. So the perpetrator finds a way to really ingrain themselves into their victim's life by filling a need in that child's life, or maybe that child's parent's life, where they can continually have access to the child. And then they work on isolation so that they're alone with the victim. And then it's not even until stage 5 where a sexual nature becomes introduced into this process. So you can see stage 1 through 4 can be quite lengthy processes and are definitely intentional and strategic in nature. And then finally, stage 6 involves maintaining control over that relationship. So once again, all this to say that the best way that we can prevent grooming or stop grooming in its tracks is to prep our children to be very aware of these stages and very aware of what abusive behavior looks like. Not feeling afraid to talk about these kinds of topics, feeling like they have the language to talk about these topics. All of those are really, really key. And I'm going to talk about a few programs toward the end of this presentation that we offer that can help you educate children, or that we offer to educate children about grooming and about sexual abuse, so that they can be the most resilient toward it that they possibly can be. So I'm going to move into a little bit around consent, only so that, again, we're all on the same page. This is an Understanding Sexualized Violence presentation. And whether you choose to, or whether teaching about consent necessarily is in your age range or in your teaching area, I think this is really great information just to know in general, and can be applied to any age group across the board. So let's take a little look. So the age of sexual consent in Canada, often everyone assumes that it's 18 because that's when we become adults, but that's not in fact true. The age of sexual consent in Canada is actually 16, meaning that once we turn 16 years old, we are able to consent to sexual activity with anyone older than us that we want. However, there are caveats to this, of course. Power and control, actually consenting, wanting to be in that situation, abusing positions of power, those kinds of things are always in effect, even if someone is 16 and engaging in sexual activity with someone who is much older than them. So let's dive into these a little bit. There are also a few, what is the word that I'm looking for? I've lost it. Close in age exceptions to the ages of consent. These close in age exceptions are rather new to our Canadian law. I believe they were put into place in 2004. And they were designed to decrease the amount of criminal activity that our youth were engaging in for engaging in healthy sexual activity that they felt was consensual and they was age appropriate, and they were exploring their sexuality around these ages. So our under 12-year-olds can never consent to sexual activity at all. It's illegal. They can't do it. Even if they think that they're consenting, legally, they cannot. It's like wanting to go buy cigarettes, but you're underage. Our 12 and 13-year-olds are legally able to consent to sexual activity with someone who is less than 2 years older than them. Okay, so I have a table in the next slide that will sort of illustrate this point a little better. So I'm just going to gloss over that for a moment. Pardon me. And then our 14 and 15-year-olds are legally able to consent to sexual activity with someone who is less than 5 years older than them. So 4 years and 364 days older than them, totally okay. 5 years older, not okay, cannot consent. So these may come as a bit of a shock to you if you did not know that these close in age exemptions existed. So just take those in for a second. These are Canadian law. But like I said, consent always is in effect. So let's take a little look at this table that we have here. So on the left side where it says your age, if we look at, let's say I'm 14, and I look across the 14-year-old column, row, you will see that I can legally engage in sexual activity with someone who is 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, or 18 up until that person turns 19, and then I cannot. And then similarly, if I'm 16, I can engage in sexual activity with someone who is 14 or older. Legally, those are okay options for me. Now, this slide or this table is available on our website. We do have a webpage called Consent 101. So if you want to take a look at that or save this image for future reference, please do. So I've been talking about all these things about consent being in effect. What does that mean? For consent to be valid, there are 5 things that it must always be. Number 1, it must always be voluntary. It can never be forced. No one can threaten you or coerce you or bribe you into consenting to sexual activity. It must always be voluntary. Secondly, it must always be enthusiastic or voluntary throughout the whole entire sexual activity, whatever it is, kissing, intercourse, whatever. Must always be, but all parties must always want to be continually engaging in that activity. If at any point someone does not want to engage in that activity, that is totally valid and they can revoke their consent. Our third criteria is that it must be individual. So I'm only consenting for me, and personal. I'm only consenting for what I actually want to do. I don't feel like I'm consenting because I should or because they want me to. Our fourth criteria is that it must be specific to both people and acts and times and places, as specific as we can be. So me providing consent today to one activity with one person does not imply consent tomorrow for the same act with the same person. I must re-consent every time, and I can say no if I want to. And finally, this is maybe the most important one. Consent must always be sober and conscious. So someone who is asleep or unconscious, of course, cannot consent. And someone who is under the influence enough that they couldn't drive, that's the legal, whatever the legal limits are in whichever province you might be in, those are the legal limits for not using substances and engaging in sexual activity. And it does go down on the onus of the person who is more sober to not engage in that sexual activity, and ensure that the person that is asking them to engage in the sexual activity is sober enough to be making that decision. So that's a really tricky area to navigate, especially as a youth, and is a really great place to, I think, start a conversation about consent and build from wherever your group of youth may be at. Okay, so bringing us to why you're here today. Why is education about sexualized violence so important? We obviously know that education about consent is probably important, and we know that education about healthy sexuality or understanding how the sexual functions of our bodies work. But teaching about sexualized violence in particular is so important for a few really key reasons, even if it's uncomfortable for us to do so. Firstly, prevention work. I cannot stress enough how not talking about a subject does not help the situation at all. No matter how uncomfortable talking about sexualized violence may be for us as educators, I guarantee that it is a disservice to our youth and our children to not teach them about what sexualized violence is and not prep them to be prepared for when they experience different parts of rape culture, which I'll talk about in a moment, when they might experience sexualized violence. Our most recent stats from Stats Canada from 2016 are that 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 6 boys experience sexualized violence before they turn 18. So before they graduate, 1/3 of our girls and 1/6 of our boys are experiencing this. So by not talking about it, all we're doing is continuing creating a taboo around this topic and not making it safe for our children that have already experienced violence or who might experience violence in the future. On the other hand, this prevention piece will also help our young people that may not understand consent and may accidentally perpetrate sexualized violence from simply not understanding what they were doing. Because this happens. It's not always with such malicious intent. And it might just be a misunderstanding of, oh, I didn't know that those age restrictions were in place. Or I didn't know that, I don't know, that it was my job to check in with them if they were more drunk than me. These kinds of scenarios happen. And it's really, really important to educate our youth about what their rights are and what their responsibilities are also. Secondly, by teaching about sexualized violence, we open up our students to a feeling of empathy towards sexualized violence survivors that our current culture does not really have. I don't know how many of you have, heard people in the news accusing perhaps celebrities or high-profile people of being sexually abusive, and perhaps a thought has rolled through our head where, oh, maybe they're making it up, or maybe they're being over dramatic. And this is not to blame you at all. I've certainly had these thoughts before, and those are thoughts that I constantly have to acknowledge and stop in their tracks in my head, because I've been conditioned throughout my life to not be empathetic towards survivors of sexualized violence and to not give them the benefit of the doubt, when in reality, the amount of people that lie or falsely report about sexualized violence is so incredibly low. It's no higher than any other crime that exists. And so by teaching our youth that sexualized violence happens to a lot of people and that we should be aware of it and that we're responsible for being empathetic towards survivors, could go a huge way, especially for our male identifying youth, to be empathetic towards survivors and be empathetic toward keeping our vulnerable people safe. And finally, as I said, a third of our girls and a sixth of our boys have already experienced sexual abuse before they're graduating. And if we're talking about sexualized violence and we're talking about consent and we're talking about healthy relationships, and even further, we're talking about the supports that are available to our students that have experienced violence, they will have an easier recovery. They will have a higher bar of resilience. They'll have a lower chance of being traumatized should they experience violence. And knowing that they have access to support will also increase their resilience and lower their chance of experiencing trauma. Not all people that experience violence, sexualized violence, feel traumatized afterward. And that has everything to do with how they are supported afterward, how they're attended to in the moment, the severity of the abuse that they experience, and so many of those pieces, other than the actual abuse that they experience, we can help set our youth up for success in those areas and resilience. Okay. So, we have our interactive activity coming up. So if you don't have this little URL already popped into another page, please do. We're going to go into what the impacts of sexualized violence might look like. And I talk about this for two reasons. One, so that perhaps you can learn something today and maybe take this learning into your own classroom and notice some behaviors that you might not have noticed before, and have a new lens, a trauma-informed lens to look through, and look at your students with more empathetic eyes and maybe a better understanding of, oh, perhaps this is what they've experienced. But also so that Perhaps you can take some of this information and teach it back to your students, depending on what age range you teach in. So let's dive in. So our nervous systems are the most impacted by trauma. And regardless of the kind of trauma, car accident, natural disaster, sexualized violence, doesn't matter, war, our nervous systems are impacted. So this is a picture of what a healthy nervous system might look like. Throughout the day, as you know, we get stressed, and so our nervous system gets aroused. And then we learn how to calm ourselves down, and we settle. And that happens throughout the day. We get stressed, we settle, we get stressed, we settle, but we stay within that ... normal range. Okay, those two dotted lines. Everyone's normal range is a bit different. Our normal range is how much stress we can tolerate as an individual without breaking, basically, without cracking, without our body being like, yep, can't handle that. I don't know what to do with this. It's the normal amount of stress that our bodies can handle. Some people have a really, really wide window of tolerance. Some people have a skinnier window of tolerance. And that's all based around our early childhood experiences and how many coping skills we have to deal with our stress. Conversely, when someone experiences a traumatic event, as you can see with our red lightning bolt there, excuse me, that amount of stress sends us outside of our window of tolerance. And so no matter how big your window of tolerance is, if it's a traumatic event, that means it's been sent, the stress level has been sent outside of your window of tolerance. And our body doesn't know how to regulate that. We don't have the tools yet to be able to deal with that amount of stress. And until we do, we may deal with symptoms of being stuck on, as you can see above our window of tolerance, which are associated symptoms with like anxiety, panic, inability to relax, emotional flooding, sleeplessness. Or we might fall below our window of tolerance to being stuck off, which are more often associated with those depressive symptoms, lethargy, deadness, disorientation, disconnection, bodily pain, those kinds of things. So this happens universally, like I said, to all trauma survivors, especially at the first traumatic experience that someone feels. So you can imagine that our body is really feeling this, and our nervous systems are responsible for a lot of really key pieces of our daily functioning. Our nervous system is responsible for our learning and our memory, our reflexes, our senses. So if that's impacted, imagine how much of your life would be impacted. And imagine that in a young, perhaps an adolescent who's already going through puberty and feeling all these hormones, and their body is already feeling dysregulated. And now they have a bunch of trauma symptoms on top of that. So that's how trauma lives and in our bodies and impacts our bodies and our brains. In a very brief way. I'm sorry that I'm not a neuropsychologist. I wish I was, but very simplified version. But the impacts go beyond just our nervous system, as I'm sure you can imagine. There are a few things that really, a few variables that can change the kinds of impacts that a survivor might experience from one survivor to the next. These things include when the sexualized violence happened, whether it was recently in the past or in young childhood, the frequency or severity of the abuse. Was this a one-time thing, or has it been ongoing for years? And then the relationship to the perpetrator. And I do apologize for diving a bit into a detail here, but I do feel it's important, so I'm going to. The myth that sexualized violence is perpetrated by strangers primarily is not true. Sexualized violence is almost always perpetrated by someone we know, and most frequently perpetrated by someone in our family unit, which is really, really awful. But it's important to know about because that's often, the stereotype is that women are running alone at night in the park. When in reality, our stats from our clients that we saw last year showed that 90% of our clients knew their perpetrator personally. So really important to keep that in mind and check your own bias around that. Did you think that that never happened? Did you think that that was just so unbelievable that we didn't want to believe that? Because those are totally fair things to think, but don't serve anyone except perpetrators, which we'll get into in a minute. So we will often break down our impacts into various different categories, but the impacts can bleed in between all of these categories. We just break these down for our own ease of understanding. So I'm going to pop out to, I cannot see. I'm going to pop out to our poll here and take a little look. So what do you think some physical impacts of sexualized violence might be? And you can feel free to type them in and hit enter, and they will anonymously pop up into our screen here. Yeah, energy, a lack of energy, injuries, tension, stomach aches is very real, sleeplessness, nausea, freezing. I'm glad we're hearing that. Impacts to our sexuality, our libido, headaches, aggression, anxiety, body aches, sleeplessness, self-harm. Thank you for putting that in there, someone. I would add pregnancy. I would add, STIs, STBBIs, which are sexually transmitted bloodborne infections like HIV. I would add in, substance use. Sleeplessness is huge. Headaches. Yeah, these are fantastic. Well done. Next, what do we think the emotional impacts? So we've broken it up between emotional and mental. So try and just think emotional this time. Yep, anxiety. Anger, certainly. Justifiably so. Depression, of course. Irritability, panic. Yeah, terror. Sadness. Guilt. Thank you. Guilt and shame are two of the biggest impacts specific to sexualized violence that survivors most often feel that shouldn't be how they feel, because that's often put on them by society or by other people. Nervousness, mistrust again, disconnection, absolutely. Absolutely, these are fantastic. Mental impacts. As I said, some of them will bleed into one another. Anxiety is certainly felt in the body, in the brain, in our emotions. Okay, our cognition is impacted. Absolutely, our concentration. Mental illness, paranoia, desexualization, depression. All right, our development can certainly be impacted. Hyper awareness, that's true. We can certainly go into overdrive, overperforming, overworking, over exercising. That would maybe be a physical thing. Yep, sex would be impacted for sure. Self-esteem. I would add in here dissociation, which is a specific term for what our brain does when it feels like, oh, it's huge in the middle. Yeah, see, shows how much I can read. I just gloss over the big words. Dissociation, for those of you that aren't familiar, is a tool, I guess, that our brain will utilize, that when we're feeling really overwhelmed in our body or our brain, our frontal lobe that sits right in the front of our brain will basically say, nope, can't do this, and it'll shut off for a little while. And what this looks like from an outsider perspective is that someone has just kind of, zoned out in their chair, and they don't look like no one's home, kind of a thing. And survivors can stay in this dissociated state for minutes, hours, days, and they can function in this state without even realizing that they're dissociated. And the tool to fighting dissociation is grounding. So breathing, engaging our senses, exercise, any of those kinds of things that sort of bring us back into the present moment, because dissociation takes us out of the present. Well done. Next would be our relational or behavioral. So how we function in society. How do you think that might be impacted if we experience trauma? Get distant from our partners. Our attachment might be impacted. We might self-isolate. Fawning, yes. So fight, flight, freezing, or fawning. So freezing, of course, is when we don't know what to do. So our body just freezes. It's like dissociation. And fawning is where we just kind of pretend to go through our day like we're okay, and try to function as if we are okay, even if we aren't feeling okay. Trust is hugely impacted by sexualized violence. Boundary setting becomes really, really difficult. Connecting to friends, family, loved ones becomes really difficult. Panic attacks. Further abuse or abusing others because we're in pain. That's an unfortunate reality sometimes. Triggers, thank you. Triggers, flashbacks, nightmares. I would almost have put those maybe in a mental category. But triggers are, like I said, anything that reminds us of the assault that we experienced or the abuse that we experienced. And oftentimes our emotions or our reactions will feel as though, we feel as though we're experiencing that traumatic situation again. So if from the outside it looks like someone's having a really big reaction to something that you don't think is a big deal, that could be what's happening. They could be experiencing a trigger and a reaction to that trigger. Hypersexualization, promiscuity, it can be very real, or asexuality, not being interested in sex anymore, or not feeling safe in sex anymore. Abstinence, yeah, great. And then finally, the spiritual impact. So here we're looking at not necessarily only in a faith-based sense, a religious sense, but in a general connectedness sense, a disbelief in perhaps faith or the system, feeling broken, a loss in faith in humanity, questioning perhaps what you believe in, or if karma is a thing, or if God loves you, hopelessness, betrayal, faith, undeserving. And so this is where our self-esteem would kind of live, where our self-worth would kind of live. And this is often where I would put feelings of suicidality, because at its core, it's a feeling of being unworthy or undeserving of living anymore, which is not true for anybody. But that's where those feelings kind of exist. Sinful, absolutely. It might be, angry at God for letting this happen. We might be having a crisis of faith, depleted. Your self-identity might be hugely impacted, especially if, this was maybe the perpetrator was maybe someone that you loved or that you built part of your identity around. Idealization. These are fantastic. Well, thank you so much for engaging in my interactive activity. It's definitely better when folks engage. So thank you. We will just bop right along because we're already at 10:47 and I want to be mindful of our time here. In regards to reporting sexualized violence, I waffled on whether or not to include this slide today, but I do think it's really important just as far as clarifying what this process looks like a little bit. So in Canada, there's no statute of limitations for reporting, just meaning that there's no timeline on when you can or cannot report sexualized violence. You can do it 50 years from now and it can still be valid. Reporting must be done in person by the survivor themselves, but that can be done at the police station. It can be done over the phone now because of COVID-19, or it can be done with a police officer coming to their location. So if you were with a student who wanted to report, you could call the Saskatoon Police Service and have them send an officer to the school to take a report if that was safer for the survivor. But just being mindful that that might not happen as quickly as we might like it to be. The process kind of goes in stages that can take a few weeks. It's not a very quick process, and the survivor has to recount their experience quite a lot of times. So it's really important that we make sure that this choice is something that a survivor really wants to do. The investigation happens on the end of the police. Either charges are laid, which would trigger the court process, or the case is closed at that point. And then a trial would take place from there. But even if the case is closed, it's really, really important to stress to our young ones that it doesn't mean that the police don't believe them or that they don't think that a sexual assault happened. It's just that they don't have enough evidence. So key. As I said, reporting is a hugely personal decision. I'm going to breeze through a few of these examples, but I'll put them up on the screen to look at later if you'd like. But there are a lot of reasons why someone may choose not to report. And if they're older, if they're 16 or older, and they're not in immediate danger, it's their choice whether they want to report or not. So our duty to report and the age of consent do clash, and it is a gray area that we are currently talking with provincial bodies about, with legal societies about. Do our 16 and 17-year-olds have to be documented and reported? Is that our duty to report? And I would argue that it is still, even if they're under or over 16. But there is a bit of a gray area. And just the point being here is that never assuming that this is an easy choice for our survivors, never assuming that this is the next best step. It's probably a step, especially if we're dealing with youth, but just being mindful of the other implicating factors that they might be thinking about when they're looking at reporting a sexual assault. And frankly, a lot of these concerns are really valid because the stats show that out of every 1,000 sexual assaults that are reported, only 3 lead to a conviction, where the perpetrator is convicted of having done what the survivor is accusing them of, and they receive some sort of sentence. The overwhelming majority of assailants walk free. And this stat here says, this is old data from 2012, but this stat here says that there are around 460,000 sexual assaults reported, when we know that that number is quite a lot higher of non-reported sexualized violence that's happening. Okay, so a bit on rape culture and rape myths. So rape culture encompasses the images, laws, social cues, and language that we see in here every day that validate and perpetuate sexualized violence. So we don't have to be a perpetrator of sexualized violence to perpetrate rape culture. We've probably all been, guilty of doing these things. I'm quite open about the past mistakes that I've made. I used to be a rather negative slut shamer. I used to blame girls for dressing poorly, scantily, or drinking too much and not being around their friends, because I was taught that that was my responsibility to keep me safe, was to not do those things. But the more that I've learned to unlearn those kinds of things, I know better now, and I can do better and think better. And those kinds of thoughts pop into my head still. And it's my responsibility to check those and say, no, that's not right. That's not their fault. It's the perpetrator's fault for taking advantage of that vulnerability. So sexualized violence happens on a bit of a continuum. Rape culture happens on a bit of a continuum. And a lot of it is based around social cueing. So here we have a pyramid of behaviors that all perpetuate rape culture. The stuff at the top is obviously the least socially acceptable, and the activities that we as a society condemn the most consistently. So obviously sexual assault, contraceptive sabotage, drugging, these things were like, woof, not okay in any way. But as we move down the pyramid toward the bottom, we'll see that things like catcalling, sexist attitudes, locker room banter, these kinds of things are so normalized in our culture. And I'm sure we've all taken part in these at some point, or laughed at a joke that we didn't think was actually very funny, but we didn't call it out. And these things are, of course, happening in our schools already from a really, really young age. And there's no better way to halt that in its tracks than by starting at a really young age and acknowledging that these things happen and that they're wrong. And really acknowledging them with like concrete examples of like, this is a sexist attitude and this is why it's wrong. Or this is what locker room banter looks like and this is why it's wrong. And really taking it from a head-on approach, because I promise that these things are already happening and I'm sure you know this. So stopping them in its tracks is the most important, and it's in those bottom few rows where we really have the work to do. Really, really have the work. I am going to, again, for the sake of time, scroll through this slide a little bit quickly, but just here the importance of shifting our language from a victim blaming lens to a supportive lens, shifting it from putting the blame of violence on the person who's experienced the violence to shifting the focus of that conversation to the perpetrator, or to a more supportive of the survivor's story lens. So being mindful of the language we choose to use. We never know who's listening. And as I've said, all rape myths do is serve perpetrators. They don't serve to play devil's advocate. They don't, do anyone any good, to, dig deeper and ask the questions about, well, why was she out all by herself? Or, boys don't get sexually assaulted. That doesn't happen. Those kinds of myths don't actually serve survivors at all. Even if you think you're trying to perhaps, point out something that other folks haven't thought of. And rape myths are so pervasive in our culture that we don't even notice. And they're perpetuated through our media and through our music and everywhere that our young people are pulling information from. So being mindful that, again, we're giving concrete examples. We're giving real life reasons as to why these are harmful. And on our website, SSAIC's website, we have a great page called Debunking Rape Myths. I think it's called Sexualized Violence 103. So I highly recommend checking that out for a bunch of really great examples of rape myths if you are looking for one place to find them all. Okay, I apologize if I do go a few minutes over 11 o'clock. I just think this information is really key, and I know I think we have till 11:30, but I'm going to try and be mindful anyway. So in your position as an educator, as someone who's kind of a consistent adult in a youth or a child's life, how can you best support these young ones? Well, first of all, if you don't take anything else away from this conversation today, I hope that you take away these key messages. How can I help? I'm here for you. Are you safe right now? What do you need right now? And then these two are the most important. I believe you, and what happened to you was not your fault. So these would obviously be really great messages to use in situations where one of our students has already disclosed that they've experienced violence. And sometimes our reaction can be to panic or shock or anger for the student, not at them, hopefully, or sadness that they've experienced this. And all of those emotions are totally valid for you to have, but not helpful in a scenario where a young person is looking to you for guidance and support and help. So these are some great back pocket terms to keep handy and share with anyone, youth or adult, that ever discloses violence to you. These ones are really great. So highly recommend screenshotting this page for future reference. In the moment, if someone is disclosing to you, I do have some recommendations just from a trauma-informed lens that will be helpful for the survivor if you do choose to utilize them. Firstly, being aware of space and touch is really key, especially during COVID times. But a trauma survivor has had a bodily violation or a boundary violated. So being aware of how much you're touching them and how close you are to them will help them feel a bit safer. Similarly, making eye contact with them, engaging with them, but gauging their comfort level, not bearing into their soul with your eyeballs if they are avoiding your eyes as much as they can. Being mindful of the level of your voice, both for calming down the survivor, but also for confidentiality, especially if you're at school. It's okay to ask clarifying questions, but just ensuring that we're not asking more questions than we need the answers to. And also that we're not asking leading questions, especially with our young ones, but clarifying questions are okay. And they show that you are listening and engaged and here with them. Reassuring them that you're there for them and that you will do whatever you can to help them. And just be a good listener and pay attention, even if that's really hard for you, even if that's triggering for you, even if you have a bajillion other things you need to be doing right now. The amount of courage that it took for that survivor to open up to you and tell you and choose you is a really huge honor, actually. So the least that we can do is give them our full attention and let them show emotion, even again, if that's uncomfortable for us, because oftentimes watching someone cry in front of us or be angry in front of us is really uncomfortable, but normal reactions. Some major don'ts to avoid if someone's disclosing to us. Like I said, not probing for more details than is necessary. Not getting distracted or talking too much, taking over that conversation. Not assuming anything, not assuming that they've told anyone, not assuming that they want to tell anyone, not assuming that they've sought medical care already, not assuming that they've reported already. Do your best not to judge their behavior or responses. Like I was talking about, all the impacts that happen to our nervous system, a lot of their behaviors and responses that might look a bit irrational or like big reactions, they probably think their reactions are a bit big and irrational too, but they don't know how, they don't have the capacity at the moment to regulate that. So do your best to give them some grace. Not pressuring them to report, of course, unless you do have your duty to report, which with our youth we often do. So that one's a bit of a moot point. And whatever you can, do your best not to take away their power. The perpetrator's already done that. So the more power and options and choices that you can give the survivor, the better. And the better that will set them up for healing and resilience in the future. So wrapping us all up here, what can you do to make a difference about sexualized violence? Let's dive right in. I'm going to skip over again this part quickly, but just to show that there are a lot of supports in Saskatoon for survivors of sexualized violence or domestic violence, interpersonal partner violence, all of these things. I guess that would maybe fall into our older teenagers. But our services at SSAIC, we do see clients age 12 and up. And then the ones that are under 12 are eligible for counseling through the Child Center at the Saskatoon Police Service. So just to know that there are wonderful resources and counseling supports for all children that experience abuse. Ways that you personally can support local charities that help survivors of sexualized violence, if that's something that you're interested in. Of course, you can donate financially, but there are other ways that you can show your support. You can subscribe to agency newsletters. You can talk about the agencies to your peer groups, to your friends, to your family. Simply talking about agencies like ours starts to break down rape culture and break down the taboo around the work that we do. You can follow them on social medias. You can buy their merchandise to financially support, and also ongoing show your support by rocking some merch from a local charity. And I challenge you to further educate yourself on things like rape myths, rape culture, the language that you use, your personal biases, being a strong ally in various survivor experiences, because all these things will help you be a better educator and help you educate about violence more openly and honestly. And you can share personal anecdotes like I've done today. You can show that it's a constant process to be growing and evolving as a human in our culture around topics that are difficult to talk about. So our services, as I talked about, we do offer counseling. We offer groups for teenagers as well. Our crisis line is available to anyone that wants to use it 24/7. We do a lot of advocacy on behalf of survivors. We can attend court. And then the resource development and public education bit are where I kind of come in. It's partly what I'm doing today, helping to educate the public around, how sexualized violence can be incorporated in the classroom, in our general workplace, in sexualized violence education, I should say. We have a ton of great resources on our website. I really highly recommend you check it out under the Learning and Resources tab at the top of our website. There's a ton of really plain language information that could easily be incorporated into any lesson plans or health units that you have coming up. It's really important to know that the health curriculum in Saskatchewan, healthy relationships and bodily autonomy and talking about abuse actually starts in about grade 3 or 4, which is where one of our big flagship programs comes in. So we offer I'm the Boss of Me, which is a grade 4 child sexual abuse prevention program. It's a puppet show plus lesson plan combo where we train the volunteers to come in and provide an age appropriate puppet show about sexual abuse. We just call it like it is. It's quite open and honest, and it's an amazing program. Both the Catholic system and the public system here in Saskatoon are in full support of this program. They encourage each and every one of their grade 4 teachers in Saskatoon to book our program annually. And so we come in and present the puppet show, and then teachers in grade 4 teach the other lesson plans around our puppet show. And they're just really amazing lesson plans that we've put, our heart and soul into. So while that is only available to our grade 4 teachers, by the way, if any of you are grade 4 teachers, this show runs annually from January to March, and we are going ahead with it this year during the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going through in a virtual way this year, and registrations are open now. So if you have any questions directly about that program, you can contact me there at that email address. And I also wanted to say that SSAIC is in the works of creating a similar program, Sans the Puppet Show, for grade 7 students. So that will be our next big project that we're working on. I'm excited to announce that. So keep an eye out for that coming up if any of your middle years teachers would maybe like some extra resources in that area. I would also recommend checking out Saskatoon Sexual Health's lesson plans that they just came out with. They do a ton of amazing education and resource development for teachers of all ages. So Saskatoon Sexual Health is a really fantastic place to check out as well in the meantime. And for those high school age groups as well. They specialize there a bit more than we do. Oh, okay, that wasn't too bad for time. I apologize for going 10 minutes over, but I'm happy to take some questions now if anybody has any. Once again, thank you so much for taking this time to be here and learn such important information with me today. I'm also happy to take any personal questions or private questions to my email account there at mprice@ssaic.ca. This is our office phone number, and as you can see, I'm not at our office. But if you do want to give us a call, any of our counselors would be more than happy to answer any of your questions there as well, if they're a bit more general or in relation to the services that we offer. I'm happy to answer any sort of education-related questions that someone may have.
All right. Thank you so much, Morgan. That was so great. Turn on my video.
There we go.
So one of the earlier questions that we had in the chat, I know you just shared some links to resources that you have, but do you have a PowerPoint with a lot of these details that are important for sharing with students in everyone's schools?
We don't, but that doesn't mean that one can't exist. I would be happy to put together in a quick format, maybe not a very beautiful PowerPoint I'll put together, but in a faster format, maybe a document quickly that would have links to all of the resources that I talked about. So teachers could easily just click on a link that they were interested in and go check that one out, like on our web pages from our website, or maybe the Saskatoon Sexual Health Lesson Plan page that I was talking about. So if that would be helpful, that's certainly something that I could pull together and get Savannah to maybe email out, or we could make public on our website as well.
Absolutely. I can include some links as well to other external resources, things like teachingsexualhealth.ca have a wealth of information on a lot of different topics, including sexualized violence. So I'll make sure to include a lot of links to external resources, as well as SSAIC's and Saskatoon Sexual Health's resources in a follow-up email.
Thanks,
so one question that popped up when the pyramid of rape culture, was, the slide was on there, is where does comedy, like stand-up comedy, fall on this?
Good question. I mean, of course it depends, and stand-up comedy is always a bit of a, a gray area, if you will, of what people find funny versus offensive. And I think stand-up comedians toe that line on purpose, and that's what makes them so engaging. I would argue that anything that promotes degrading behavior in a sexual nature toward anyone, not just women, but degrading sexual behavior or toxic masculinity, I feel like that's a part of rape culture. But like I've said, we're all guilty of enjoying things that perhaps might be a part of rape culture, like movies that are terrible or music that is perhaps degrading. And it doesn't mean that we're not allies or that we should totally nix all of those things out of our lives, but it's being conscious and aware of what we're choosing to ingest and looking through a lens of, okay, I understand that this is perhaps not the best media or whatever to be ingesting. And I'm just having like a relaxing night, so I'm just going to watch this crappy movie, but with the mindfulness that, I understand that that's still wrong. Something that I appreciate that my parents did with me a lot when I was younger is we would watch all kinds of movies and TV shows, and then my parents would always have a conversation with me about it after. So in relation to youth in classrooms or with your own children, perhaps that's something that I would further want to continue engaging in those things, but just having a conversation about it after.
Mm-hmm. Seems like a good segue into me plugging another workshop that we have coming up in January on digital literacy skills with mediasmarts.ca. So that's specific to what Morgan was saying, teaching those critical thinking skills in response to whatever media that you might be consuming in order to determine whether this is something that is good to model behavior on or whether it merits more question and criticism.
Especially because it's going to exist no matter what. So we might as well just have conversations about it and be literate around talking about it.
Exactly. Another question that came in, explain revenge porn, please.
Oh, sure. Revenge porn is illegal, first of all, is a part of rape culture, is a sexual assault. It is where someone that has video recording of you engaging in a sexual activity shares it without your consent. So whether they privately show their buddy or post it to Pornhub, always illegal. They cannot share that without your consent. That's your private, it's like an extension of your body. That is your property. And it is illegal for them to consent on your behalf by sharing that photo without your consent or video.
When that collides with someone who's under the age of 18, what are the implications of that?
It would become child abuse and be even worse legally.
Yeah, and child pornography potentially.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So definitely something that merits more conversation.
More conversation and legal action. And I am also, oh sorry, my foot's all tied around this. And also legal reprimand. There would be a higher opportunity for that, unfortunately, however you look at it.
So one of the things that you'd mentioned earlier on was on asking younger kids clarifying questions rather than leading questions. Can you give some examples of what clarifying questions might be?
Yeah. One of the biggest offenders that we see is, for some reason, adults often don't like telling young children the names of genitals because we feel like they're dirty words or inappropriate words, or we're uncomfortable with the words penis, testicles, vagina, vulva, breasts, whatever, bum, who knows. So we use, pretend words like cookie or noodle or whatever, chicken. Like we just use like made up words to refer to these body parts. So a good example with young children, and that I've had firsthand experience in doing our I'm the Boss of Me program is a child disclosed to me that someone was touching his noodle. And instead of saying, is your noodle your penis? I said, what does noodle mean? And he was able to describe it to me. But a leading question, which is your noodle your penis, would be inappropriate. Or it's technically, you're really supposed to try to avoid putting words in children's mouth. So by asking them to clarify rather than yes or no questions, those are good guides, especially with our really little ones.
So would you say that teaching concepts like proper body part language and all of these early conversations that we can have before we actually start talking about rape, like how important are they? What other recommendations would you have for early education in terms of sexual violence prevention?
So for our really little ones, like maybe starting in like grade 2 even, I would start there with like, I'm not a teacher, don't get me wrong. So whenever we start talking about, we're going to call this an arm, we're going to call this a penis, whenever that starts, roll in with it. The more normalized it is at a younger age, the less taboo it becomes when we become teenagers and everything's weird. Another great place to start with our really little ones is just bodily autonomy. That this is their body and they're in control of what happens with their bodies. These are some of the main messages that we talk about in I'm the Boss of Me for our grade 4 students. But I look at someone like my coworker, for example, who has a 4-year-old, and he already understands everything about sexual body parts, bodily autonomy, that his body is his own and he can say no. And that's only because my coworker that's been normal conversation throughout his entire life so far. And that family is a perfect model of, you can teach young kids these topics. They're not hard, they're not challenging, they're not scary. And she's setting her child up to be a really great, I think, man in society, should he identify that way as he gets older. So bodily autonomy would be a huge one too. And that, they don't have to hug grandma all the time if they don't want to. They don't have to sit on Uncle whoever's knee just because he wants to if they don't want to. Those are choices that they can make, and teaching them that that's okay.
Great. We have another question in our Q&A box. So how does that interact with the court system? Revenge porn, picture and video as an extension of the body. Can a potential victim not be allowed to show evidence if one party, perpetrator, does not consent to the video being shown in court?
Not a lawyer, so I don't know the answer to that question. I would, if that's genuinely a question that you want the answer to, I would highly recommend that you get in contact with the Crown Prosecutor's Office in Saskatoon. Crown prosecutors are lawyers that specifically, a group of them specifically work on sexual assault cases. And part of the Crown Prosecutor's Office job is to educate the public on questions exactly like that. So you would be totally within your right to just shoot them an email and be like, I have this question. In fact, one of our board members is a Crown prosecutor. Her name is Lynn Lee. Perhaps I'll put her contact information in the chat here quickly, because she said she's always open to receiving questions from the public. And she is a Crown prosecutor that works directly in sexual assault cases. And she's super duper. So highly recommend getting in contact with her and asking that question. She would be much more equipped to accurately answer that question than I am. I apologize.
Don't apologize at all. So with I'm the Boss of Me moving to an online format this year, do you anticipate that you'll have the capacity to offer it to people outside of the Saskatoon area at all? Or
So I want to so badly. I wanted to, this will be my second year or third year. I don't even know, I've lost track already. My second year doing the I'm the Boss of Me program. And sorry, I cannot multitask. There we go. Okay, that is Lynn Lee's contact information if you'd like to get a hold of her. I would love to expand out to the Prairie Spirit School Division, particularly, especially because it's the closest around Saskatoon. I don't know why we couldn't expand outside of Saskatoon, or like outside of Prairie Spirit even, except for capacity wise. Currently our program is set up for us to meet the demand of the 86 or so elementary schools in Saskatoon that exist. And I think that by 2022, so by winter 2022, I think we'll be able to start expanding into other school divisions. But because this is our first year of trying out this electronic format, we kind of want to pilot it with the school divisions that are already used to having it. But I'm excited to hopefully expand it out soon, but it won't be, unfortunately, in 2021. I apologize. I'd like it to be.
Yeah, it would be great if everything could be accessible all over. Yeah,
of course.
One day. So I think we have maybe time for one last question or one more if another comes in. So how do you reduce the stigma with sexualized violence in Indigenous communities while engaging in educational and supportive conversations regarding sexual violence?
Sorry, can you repeat the first part of that? Was it in the Q&A? I can take a look at it too. Yes. Reducing the stigma with sexualized violence in Indigenous communities. I honestly, the only difference in Indigenous communities that I would make from the other stuff I've already touched on today would be incorporating the fact that intergenerational trauma is a reality. So for those of you that aren't familiar maybe with the history of colonization and residential schools and the 60s scoop here in Saskatchewan, and neocolonialism as it continues to exist today. Colonialism is still happening. It's not something that used to happen. Being really aware that sexualized violence happened abundantly in those kinds of scenarios to Indigenous people by settler people. And having that lens and that knowledge that that trauma happened perhaps 1 or 2 generations ago, but is absolutely still impacting Indigenous communities today. It's impacting family dynamics. And as I talked about how much abuse happens within family units, that unfortunately continues to happen by people that have been abused because they're not receiving the kinds of support and the kind of help and the kind of healing and resilience and resources that they need for a variety of reasons that I won't get into today. But as far as reducing the stigma, I think a part of that is incorporating Indigenous healing practices and traditional practices into conversations in Indigenous communities, and simply just talking about it. Like there's no, that's a huge piece. I am not an Indigenous person. I should say I'm definitely a settler person. So I'm not the most knowledgeable person to be asking about this kind of information, but from what I've learned from Indigenous elders and Indigenous knowledge keepers in my community, talk therapy is one of the most healing, and storytelling is one of the most healing pieces in Indigenous culture. So giving folks the space and opportunity to share their story over and over and over again until they feel like they have gotten what they need out of that. I would say that is the biggest stigma eraser that we can do. And then for our settler youth, perhaps more so in Saskatoon, getting less of an Indigenous population concentrated here in the city, talking about things like residential schools, even at a young age, talking about things like the fact that sexual abuse happened at residential schools. And it's nothing to be ashamed of now, but it is shameful if we try and hide the fact that that happened. talking about that those things happen and that we need to grow from it will help A, with reconciliation, and B, with reducing that stigma between seller and Indigenous communities, I think.
Thank you so much, Morgan.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's all of the questions that we have for now.
Yay.
So I will be following up with everyone with all of the different resources that we mentioned in this workshop today, as well as some others that I will find as well. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. It was so great to have you present. I love all the interactivity that you use. And I'll also share Morgan's contact information again in that follow-up email. A reminder for everyone that this presentation was recorded, so you can come back and review any of the information that you need. I will share a link to that recording in my follow-up email. Our next webinar, these are all free webinars in the Teaching Sex Ed series, is on January 12th at 10 a.m. and is on communication and consent. So looking at sexual communication and how we can empower youth and kids that we work with to speak clearly and understand the importance of communication in our sexual and romantic relationships, as well as touching on the importance of consent and communication at that time. As well, we also have another amazing presentation coming up with renowned researcher and social activist Jackson Katz. So if you've never heard of Jackson Katz before, I highly recommend you take a look into some of his documentary films that he has released, including a new one called The Man Card, which explores masculinity and politics. And another event that we have coming up for Saskatchewan Violence Prevention Week, which is November 30th until December 6th, is that the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute has sponsored a free streaming link for the Bystander Moment, which is one of Jackson Katz's films, and it explores how we can contend with rape culture and empower youth and men to be leaders in sexual assault prevention. So his presentation on December 3rd with us that we are hosting will be on preventing sexual violence and how to empower youth and strategies for empowering youth to become leaders in this movement toward preventing sexualized violence. One last thing that I will note outside of my follow-up email, which will be filled with things, including links to registration for all of those webinars. I am giving out a copy of Beyond the Basics, which is from Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights, to some lucky attendee in this session. And it's filled with chapters upon chapters of lesson plans and information that you can use both for sex ed class and for concepts like this, talking about consent and rape culture over time. So I will be emailing someone later this afternoon to let them know that they've won that opportunity. And then finally, if you are interested in keeping up to date on a lot of these opportunities or different free resources and reports that are released on the topic of adolescent sexual health, you can join the Adolescent Sexual Health Community of Practice Google group, which the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute manages, by emailing me at sholt@skprevention.ca. So that's everything for now. I'll include all of this information again in that follow-up email. So have a wonderful afternoon.